Linking is a basic element of American English pronunciation. In a dictionary, words are given in isolation. In natural speech, however, you don't say words separately, you link them. In this video, we practiced linking in the song, "There's a Hole in My Bucket." First, let's review. If a word ends in a consonant sound, for example, hole, and the next word begins with a vowel sound, in, we move the consonant sound in front of the vowel sound. A hole in my bucket. Hole in. Hole in. No, we're talking about the last sound, not the last written letter. The word hole ends in the sound L. And now let's practice linking with our song, "There's a Hole in My Bucket." Henry has a job to do. Get water from a well. And you have a job to do. Find places in the song where you can link a consonant sound and a vowel sound. First, you find the linking, then we'll sing the song together. One. Henry, fetch me some water. There's a hole in my bucket, dear Liza, dear Liza. There's a hole in my bucket, dear Liza, a hole. Well, fix it, dear Henry, dear Henry, dear Henry. Well, fix it, dear Henry, dear Henry, fix it. To fetch, to go get something. There's a hole in. Fix it. Two. With what shall I fix it, dear Liza, dear Liza? With what shall I fix it, dear Liza? With what? With straw, dear Henry, dear Henry, dear Henry. With straw, dear Henry, dear Henry, with straw. The straw is too long, dear Liza, dear Liza. The straw is too long, dear Liza, too long. Shall I fix it? Straw is. Three. Then cut it, dear Henry, dear Henry, dear Henry. Then cut it, dear Henry, dear Henry, cut it. With what shall I cut it, dear Liza, dear Liza? With what shall I cut it, dear Liza? With what? With the knife, dear Henry, dear Henry, dear Henry. With the knife, dear Henry, dear Henry, with a knife. Cut it. Shall I? With the. Four. The knife is too dull, dear Liza, dear Liza. The knife is too dull, dear Liza, too dull. Then sharpen it, dear Henry, dear Henry, dear Henry. Then sharpen it, dear Henry, sharpen it. With what shall I sharpen it, dear Liza, dear Liza? With what shall I sharpen it, dear Liza? With what? Knife is. Sharpen it. Shall I? 5. With a stone, dear Henry, dear Henry, dear Henry. With a stone, dear Henry, dear Henry, with a stone. The stone is too dry, dear Liza, dear Liza. The stone is too dry, dear Liza, too dry. Then wet it, dear Henry, dear Henry, dear Henry. Then wet it, dear Henry, dear Henry, wet it. With the stone. Stone is. Wet it. 6. With what shall I wet it, dear Liza, dear Liza? With what shall I wet it, dear Liza? With what? With water, dear Henry, dear Henry, dear Henry. With water, dear Henry, dear Henry, with water. In what shall I fetch it, dear Liza, dear Liza? In what shall I fetch it, dear Liza? In what? Shall I? Wet it. Fetch it. 7. In a bucket, dear Henry, dear Henry, dear Henry. In a bucket, dear Henry, dear Henry. In a bucket. There's a hole in my bucket, dear Liza, dear Liza. There's a hole in my bucket, dear Liza, a hole in a bucket. There's a hole in. And let's review. Shall I? There's a. With the knife. With the stone. In a bucket. Hole in. Knife is. Straw is. Stone is. Fetch it. Cut it. Fix it. Sharpen it. Wet it. If you like this video, before you go, hit the thumbs up button and try the quiz for this lesson. Or you might like one of these related lessons.